Let's go to his philosophy in general. What would be the general characteristics of Spinoza's philosophy? His philosophy is an integrated system combines philosophy or religion, ethics, and metaphysics into an organic whole. So philosophy, religion, ethics, metaphysics. You can say it's the theodicy, ethics, and metaphysics. Okay? So try to combine this. Uh, the modern philosophers, especially the rationalist philosophers, that were trying to create a kind of philosophy, a kind of philosophical system that would somehow connect or relate philosophy and science, meaning the new discoveries of science, connecting that with philosophy. His notion of God is inextricably woven into his theory of ultimate reality. It becomes impossible to separate the two and understand one without the other. It's a combination of theodicy, his idea of God, and metaphysics, his idea of reality. So he would combine the two, reality and God, substance and God. Okay? So it's theodicy and metaphysics integrated into one. Okay? So, as I've already mentioned, in his early years, he subscribed to the idea of Descartes about the dualism of the body and the mind, that these two, the body and the mind, are separate substances, the res cogitans and the res extensa. But later on, he changed his view and asserted that they are not separate substances, but they form a single substance. So what happens to the body and the mind? The body represents the extension, and the mind represents thought. And extension and thought, or thought and extension, are two attributes of one and the same substance, who is, or which is, God. Okay, so that's the main idea of Spinoza. Now let's go to first very important concept in Spinoza, the nature of substance. We've been talking about God is the same, is one substance, nature, reality, they're all just the same. It's a monistic metaphysics. So what does understand by substance? He said, ultimate reality is composed of a single substance, and that is God. So remember that this God of Spinoza is not the personal being that we think of God as the Almighty. Okay? So it's not the transcendent personal God anymore. Okay? But it is a God that we can say immanent, meaning it is found in the whole of reality, because the whole of reality is no less than God Himself. So the rest of reality consists merely of the attributes and modifications of the substance. So what we see in this reality, people, objects, physical things, these are just modes of God or modifications, you can say manifestations of God. Okay, so let's explain that. Okay, so of course the conclusion is that reality is God and God is reality or nature, okay, or substance. So God, reality, nature, substance, they mean one and the same thing for Spinoza. Okay? Now, so when you think of God as the only reality, as the only being, therefore there is no other being besides the divine being. Everything in this world, in this reality, is a part of that divine substance or being. It's quite a lot to digest intellectually or mentally or conceptually. How could everything be just part of this substance? When I think of myself, I am also a substance. Because I exist in myself as a being. Right? Now, To understand that, let us use an analogy. By analogy, the substance or nature or God may be compared to our body, which is composed of our different parts, our hands, fingers, head, you know, feet, etc. But every part constitutes the whole system of the body. So everything in our body has been created by our body and collectively constitutes our body. And therefore, our body has holistic properties over and above the sum of its parts. So when you think of your finger, the finger may just be part of the body. Okay, our hands. Yeah, you can separate the hand from the body, but the hand is always conceived and thought of as part of the body. So the body is the whole substance. The body is the whole of reality. The body is nature. The body is God. And there are many different parts within that body. Okay? So that's the idea of substance as the ultimate reality, and that this ultimate reality is God. So outside of the body, there is nothing. Of course, yeah, there are other bodies, but we're using this body as a kind of analogy to, in order to for us to understand the meaning of substance and the parts of the divine substance or being. So everything that exists in nature, in the universe, is one reality. It is one substance. It is God. And there's no one, no, there's only one set of rules governing the whole of reality. In the same manner, there's one set of rules that govern the functioning of our body. So he defines the substance this way. It is that which is in itself and is conceived through itself. So it's the same as the definition of the other rationalists, and in fact, the same as the definition of the scholastics and of Aristotle. Substance is that which is exists in itself, and it is also thought through itself. Okay? In Book 1 of the Ethics, we find this quotation. So, um, by substance, this is definition, no? First definition 3. By substance, I understand what is in itself and is conceived through itself. That is, that whose concept does not require the concept of another thing from which it must be formed. So it is thought of to be thought of in itself. You don't need any other thing and any other concept to conceive it or to think of it. That's a substance. Okay? And remember here that since there's only one being, then substance and being are just one and just one and the same. So this definition has two components. One, that a substance is what exists in itself. It is an ultimate metaphysical subject. It exists in itself. So if we're going to refer to Aristotle, okay, substance would be the main category of being. The accidents, they're also being because they exist, but they exist in something else. Meaning, for example, when you think of a color, it is a being because it exists, but it does not exist in itself because it would need something like red. You don't see red in itself existing. You find it existing in some other things, right? Like a red car, a red dress, red house, or red object. But the object, the dress, the car, they are substance because they exist in themselves. But of course, if you use this, if we go back to Spinoza, these cars, this dress, this house, etc., etc., they are parts of one substance, which is reality. Okay? But for Aristotle, everything is a substance. But for Spinoza, there's only one substance, and that is nature or God. Okay, and everything that we find here are just parts of that substance. So that's the meaning of substance. It exists in itself. The second, other things may exist as features of a substance. So a substance does not exist as a feature of anything. Other things, like for example, colors, the other attributes, they exist as a feature of the substance. Now, the second is that a substance is that or is what is conceived through itself. Meaning, the idea of a substance does not involve the idea of anything, any other thing. Like for example, when you think of the quality of the color, you have to think of what is this red something. So you have to think of a something in order for us to think of red or any other feature. But for Spinoza, when you say substance, it it's just that it exists. So you don't need to consider any other concepts to think about the substance. That's the meaning of this point of Spinoza. So as a consequence, it means that substance is both ontologically and conceptually independent. By ontological, we mean it is it has independent existence, and conceptually, it means it has a formal independence, meaning it exists, it is thought of conceptually independent of any other concepts. Okay, so it's both ontologically and conceptually independent. It exists by itself ontologically, and it is thought in itself conceptually independent. That's the meaning of that of the term. So substance is self-contained in thought and existence. Okay, so in thought, conceptually, existence, ontologically. Okay. Now, so there is only one substance, but this substance has several or actually infinite attributes. Okay. So what are these attributes? The substance consists. Remember that this substance is also God. Okay, and this substance is reality, is nature. It consists of infinite attributes, and each of these attributes expresses eternal and infinite essentiality. So if the substance is eternal and infinite, therefore its attributes will also be eternal and infinite. So again, book 1 of ethics, that this is definition 4, he said, by attribute I understand what the intellect perceives of a substance as constituting its essence. So the attribute is what the intellect understands to be the constitution, the basic elements of its essence. So when I think of a substance, what are its attributes? What constitutes a substance? So an attribute is not just any property of a substance. It is its very essence. Let's use an example here. And this is just an analogy. If we think of a triangle, what would be the attribute of a triangle? Well, when you think of a triangle, there must be 3 sides and 3 angles. So 3 sides and 3 angles are not just any ordinary property of a triangle. It constitutes its very essence. It constitutes what really a triangle is, that it has 3 sides and 3 angles. So he said, so close is the association of an attribute in substance, of which it is an attribute that for Spinoza, there is no real distinction between them. There's no real distinction between a triangle and a polygon with 3 sides and 3 angles. Because you can actually convert the two. A polygon with 3 sides and 3 angles is actually a triangle. So they are intimately associated, closely connected to one another. So When you say substance, God is a substance. Therefore, God has infinite attributes. But according to Spinoza, since our mind is limited, we cannot fully understand these infinite attributes of God. And we can only understand two, because we find these two attributes also in us. And these two attributes are mind and matter, or thought and extension. And that actually corresponds to the res cogitans and res extensa of Descartes. Mind is res cogitans. Okay? Thought is mind and thought are res cogitans. Matter and extension are res extensa. So it corresponds to the two substances of Descartes. Only that for Spinoza, these two known attributes are not real substances, but they are just attributes of one and the same substance. Now, let's go to the next mode. So you have the substance, and then we know of two attributes, and then the mode. The mode, according to Spinoza, is what exists in another and conceived through another. It exists in another and conceived through another. So it's totally different from the substance, because the substance exists in itself and conceived in itself. But a mode is exists in another and conceived through another. So what does he mean by mode here? Again, definition number 5, he said, by mode, I understand the affections of a substance, or that which is in another through which it is also conceived. That's quite difficult to digest. So let's come up with this explanation. Specifically, a mode exists as a modification or an affection of a substance. Meaning, when you say affection or modification, it's something that we perceive of a substance. It is something that the substance, that an object manifests to us. Okay? And therefore, of course, we cannot think of that modification apart from the substance. I'll give a specific examples later on. Let's just finish this distinction between substance and attributes and modes. In contrast to substances, modes are ontologically and conceptually dependent. Dependent on what? Dependent on the substance. Okay? Like for example, let us say color. The color, one, red, for example, red. Red would be dependent conceptually, ontologically on the object, okay, that it manifests. For example, uh, a red book. I'm looking at a red book here. So red is dependent ontologically to the book, and conceptually it is dependent on the book. Because when I think of red, I think of a book. Of course, you can think of any other objects: red car, red dress, red anything. Okay, but it will always be dependent on that particular substance. Okay, so here, in contrast to substance, meaning it's actually a substance. It's not really a plural. No? It's a singular. So the starting point of Spinoza is the Cartesian concept of substance. When you think of it, it's like the definition of Descartes: that which exists by itself and which is conceived by itself. And of course, this Cartesian notion of substance is not really something that is original and unique to Descartes, because it's been the definition of substance even by the scholastics and even by Aristotle. Okay? So this means that the thing whose concept has no need of the concept of any other thing in order to be formed. Okay, so that's the starting point of his metaphysics, or concept of substance. And then what Spinoza did was to logically and rationally develop the latent pantheism of this Cartesian concept to its extreme consequences. So, God as the only substance or reality. So, we have said that there's only one substance, and that is God. And this is his explanation to this very critical point, that there's only one substance or reality. He said, An existing substance necessarily exists. No existing substance could have failed to exist, of course, because it could not be necessary if it does not exist. But there's only one substance, that is God, that actually exists. And that only this one substance could have existed. So that's, of course, that's a very rationalistic argumentation to prove that only God exists. Only this substance exists. Since God is the only possible substance, it is impossible for any other substance besides God to exist. Therefore, with respect to substances, the actual world with its one substance is the only possible world. And this world, this nature, this reality necessarily exists. So, Spinoza's argument for this conclusion has two main stages. First, all possible substances necessarily exist. All possible substances necessarily exist. But God is the only possible substance. So, first one is the major premise. All possible substances necessarily exist. But there's only one possible substance. So this is a very, very clear syllogism. And therefore, only God necessarily exists. So that would be the conclusion. So by God, he said, this is not the definition of of Spinoza of God. So he defined what substance is, what attributes, and what mode is. And then now he is trying to offer us a definition of God. He said, by God, I understand a being absolutely infinite. That is, a substance consisting of an infinite attributes, of which each one expresses an eternal and infinite essence. So we've said already that there is a close relationship between the attribute and substance. So now, Spinoza is telling us that this substance that we have been defining is no other than God. And therefore, the attributes of the substance that we have been defining, infinite attributes, is also attributed to God. And that these attributes expresses the eternal and infinite essence of God. So, since God is an infinite substance, the number of God's attributes is unlimited, and that there is no attribute that God does not possess. Spinoza viewed God and nature as two names for the same reality. So, we go now to so here, there is no other attributes that God does not possess. But of course, we can only know two things, two attributes, thought and extension. Okay. Now, the next is that, so we have substance, and then he defined God, and now he tried to connect or relate God and nature, because for him, God and nature are just the same. But he said, God and nature are two names for the same reality. So God and nature are the same. Just they differ in names, okay? In how we call them. He said, they are single substance, that which stands beneath rather than matter, that is the basis of the universe, and of which all lesser entities are actually modes or modifications. So now he introduces the concept of entities. So the physical objects that we find here, that we see here, these are entities. These entities are not actual substances. They are just modes or modification of the single substance, who is God, or reality, or nature. So God is unique, and he embraces all reality. It is eternal, meaning outside of the limits of time. uh, it's infinite, meaning it's endowed with infinite attributes or perfection. Of these infinite attributes, we only know two, and these are thought and extension. And therefore, this abolishes the Cartesian duality of the substance as res cogitans and res extensa, and reduce these two perfections, these two, extensa and cogitans, as two perfections or attributes of one single substance. Now, some consequences of this metaphysics, monistic metaphysics of Spinoza. He reduced the physical and mental worlds as one and the same. So, the physical and the mental, thought and extension, matter and mind, is one the same reality. That substance consists of both body and mind, and there's no difference between these two aspects. Okay, they only differ in the kind of attributes that they manifest. Okay. Now, let's go to the proof for God's existence. Of course, having established substance and God and nature, there's actually no need to prove God's existence for Spinoza. But let's just say, let's go over how he tried to offer a proof for the existence of this being. By positing a pantheistic stance, meaning that the whole of reality is God, all exists is God, and God is all that exists, Spinoza encountered very little difficulty in proving God's existence with finality. Because you can just say, you can just ask, is there anything that exists? Of course, we can say, well, yes, there is something that exists. And once we say that there is something that exists, then that's already the proof for God's existence, because God is all that exists. So this is a rational, some kind of a Parmenidean, a kind of Parmenidean argument to prove God's existence or to prove the existence of being. So to the question, does anything exist? An affirmative answer is expected to prove that God exists. So God exists by definition. The existence of God and his essence are one and the same. God, the substance, really exists. Now, of course, you can say, well, he has proven the existence of God by definition. Yes, but as to the question, is there anything that exists? Is there anything that you see all around you existing, including yourself? Of course, the answer is yes. And once you answer that there is something that exists, and that includes you, then he has already proven that God exists. But just the same, he offers this proof, which is a very formal proof. So in Proposition 11, still part, book 1 of Ethics, he said, God or substance, consisting of infinite attributes, of which each expresses eternal and infinite essentiality, necessarily exists. The proof for this is this. If this be denied, that meaning that uh, preceding proposition, if possible that God does not exist, then his essence does not involve existence. But this, referring to proposition 7 earlier, is absurd. Therefore, God necessarily exists. So remember that he has given us the definition and then the proofs. So he will just be referring, well, I have said this in the proof, so that's exactly what he meant by proposition 7. So like Anselm, Spinoza gives his argument in the form of a reduction ad absurdum, meaning he reduced the counter argument to an absurdity. If you're going to argue against his argument, then if you're going to deny his argument, that will result to absurdity. Okay, so here here's the argument of Spinoza. The idea of God is that of a substance with infinite attributes, each of which is eternally and infinitely essential. Next, suppose that God does not exist. Then, existence is not part of his essence. However, existence belongs to the nature of a substance, and therefore God exists. So, in this kind of argument, you can only argue against the first premise. The idea of God is that of substance with infinite attributes, each of which is eternally and infinitely essential. Because these first parts of this argument are actually part of his propositions, of his definitions. Okay? So if you subscribe to that first part of the argument, the premise, then everything will just logically, rationally follow. Okay? So to deny this argument would be a kind of absurdity. Right? Now let's go to the modes of God. For Spinoza, there are two sides of nature. First, there is the active, productive aspect of the universe. So we're not talking of God as nature. Okay? God as nature. So there is the productive aspect of nature or the universe. So this would be God and his attributes, from which all else follows. This is what Spinoza calls natura naturans. Natura naturans. Naturing nature. So strictly speaking, if you're going to conceptualize it, this is identical with God. Okay, this aspect is identical with God. This is the active, productive aspect of nature or the universe. The other aspect of the universe is that which is produced or sustained by the active aspect. So he calls this natura naturata. Natura naturans, the active, productive, and the produced and sustained is the natura naturata. Natured nature. So again, this is a quote from the Ethics. He said, before going any further, I wish here to explain what we should understand by nature viewed as active, natura naturans, and nature viewed as passive, natura naturata. I say to explain, or rather call attention to it, for I think that from what has been said, it is sufficiently clear that by nature viewed as active, meaning natura naturans, we should understand that which in itself and is conceived through itself, or those attributes of substance which express eternal and infinite substance. In other words, God insofar as he is considered as a free cause. That's the natura naturans. Now, let's go to the next. By nature viewed as passive, natura naturata, I understand all that which follows from the necessity of the nature of God and of any of the attributes of God. That is, all the modes of the attributes of God, insofar as they are considered as things which are in God and which without God cannot exist or be conceived. So that's book 1, no? Proposition 29. That's the distinction between the natura naturata, natura naturans, and natura naturata. So if you're going to, the thing that we see here is still part of God, but this is the passive produced aspect of nature or of substance. So, from God conceived as natura naturans, necessarily proceed as the unfolding of God's very nature, man and the world of things. So we are part of the natura, no? naturans. Okay? Man, the world of things, or the modes of modification of the substance of God as natura naturata. So the active is the natura naturans. We are the produced. We are the natura naturata. Naturing substance active, natured, naturing nature active, natured nature is the passive. I hope you get the distinction between the two. Now, the modes. There are two types of modes. This is the modes of the substance. Okay, the finite and eternal, and the finite and temporal. So let's distinguish again from the ethics. All things which follow from the absolute nature of any attribute of God must always exist and be infinite. Or in other words, are eternal and infinite through the said attribute. So you have God, there's only one substance, God, and we separate this. Well, there are many other separations, attributes, thought and extension. That's as far as we can understand, because if God is eternal and infinite, then there are many other attributes. But because we have very limited understanding, we limit our understanding to only two. Okay, so the thought and extension. Whatsoever follows from any attribute of God, insofar as it is modified by a modification, meaning the mode, which exists necessarily and as infinite through the said attribute, must also exist necessarily and as infinite. Every mode which exists both necessarily and as infinite must necessarily follow either from the absolute nature of some attributes of God, or from an attribute modified by a modification which exists necessarily and as infinite. So that's from part 1, proposition 23 of the ethics. We continue. Everything, every individual thing, or everything which is finite, so this is for the finite or temporal, and has a conditioned existence, cannot exist or be conditioned to act unless it be conditioned for existence and action by a cause other than itself, which is also finite and has conditioned existence, meaning temporal existence. And likewise, this cause cannot in its turn exist or be conditioned to act unless it be conditioned for existence and action by another cause, which is also finite and has a condition, meaning temporal existence, and so on to infinity. Now, let's start to explain that. This is actually another proof, okay, from from the from the ethics. I'm just showing this to you because, well, you can take a look at this. Anyway, since this is recorded, then you're going to have, at least in the recording, this quotation from the ethics will be shown. Let me just point this last acronym here, QED. I put here the definition. That's quod erat demonstrandum. I suppose some of you who are familiar with Latin know exactly what it means. No? That which need to be demonstrated, or that was intended to be demonstrated. So you see this every now and then, at the last part of the discussion of Spinoza, this QED. Okay, so let's discuss the modes, okay, based on what we have quoted. The first mode consists in what he calls infinite and eternal modes of the substance. So what are these? These are pervasive features of the universe, each of which follows from the divine nature insofar as it follows from the absolute nature of one or other of God's attributes. So these are the infinite, eternal manifestation of God based on God's attributes. So I'm going to present a table later on. So for example, here, you have the modes of motion and rest. So motion and rest are attributes of reality, attributes of the substance. But this motion and rest fall under the extension, under the attribute of extension. Okay? So motion and rest, eternal. It's an eternal mode under the extension of thought. Under the attribute of thought, the mode is the infinite intellect. Okay? Infinite intellect or infinite ideas. Okay? Infinite ideas or absolute ideas, if you can, to use that, this is a different term. Okay. What about the finite and temporal modes? These are simply the singular things that populate the universe. So these things that we can see, the finite and temporal, objects here, these are the modes. These are the manifestation of the substance. The modes of this type follow from the divine nature as well as, but do so only as it follows from one or another of God's attributes, insofar as it is modified by a modification that is in itself finite and temporal. Now, let's give an example here. The individual bodies that we see, individual objects, things, planets, trees, animals, etc., inanimate objects here, books, everywhere, they are modes under the attribute of extension. Our ideas, okay, so different from the infinite idea, our individual ideas, they are modes under the attribute of thought. So if you're going to put this in a table, it will be like this. Sorry, I will go back to that, but let's just have this here. So the finite in eternal modes, thought and extension. The modes will be motion and rest. Okay, of course, it's not just motion and rest. There may be some other modes of extension, right? Like measurement, okay, quantity, for example, okay? Quantity. And under thought, you have infinite ideas or infinite intellect. And then for the finite and temporal modes, under the attribute of extension, you have individual physical bodies, material bodies, okay? And under the attribute of thought, you have individual ideas, our ideas, okay? So these are the different modes. Now let's go back to the previous slide. So these temporal and finite modes, okay, they are determinations, they are aspects of the divine attributes, namely of thought and extension. So since they are temporal and finite, they don't really last. They may appear and then disappear, like us. Like, for example, our gadgets, they are here, they manifest certain modes, certain qualities, but later on, they will be gone. So they are likened by, according to Spinoza, they are likened to the white caps on the ocean. They appear for a moment, only to be reabsorbed by the same waters that have produced them. So imagine the ocean. That's the reality. That's substance. That's nature. That's God. Okay? And of course, there are many other attributes of the oceans. Maybe, for example, in the case of extension, maybe the current will always be there. And then there will always be waves. Okay? And the waves will be manifested by the white caps. You know, when the sea is rough, you have the white caps. And the white caps may appear once in a while, and then they are absorbed by the ocean again. So the modes are like that. Okay? So think of your cell phone. It may be manifestation of something, and then it will, for a time, it will be there, and then it will disappear, because it's just a temporal and finite mode of the attributes of this reality or of this being. Okay, so necessity of things. The intellect must comprehend the attributes of God and the modifications of God and nothing else. Okay? The intellect, in function as will or desire or love, should be referred to passive nature and not to active nature. So the intellect, as comprehending the nature of God, is the active, as will and desire, it is the passive nature of the intellect. Now, things could not be better than the design or manner that God made them. So God, out of His nature, designed everything, and for Spinoza, it cannot be other than what or how God made them or created them. So he said, things could not have been brought into being by God in any manner or in any order different from what which has in fact obtained. So this reality cannot be otherwise than what God designed it to be. Because all things necessarily follow from the nature of God, and by the nature of God are conditioned to exist and act in a particular way. If things therefore could have been of a different nature or have been conditioned to act in a different way, so that the order of nature would have been different, God's nature would also have been able to be different from what it is now. Therefore, that different nature also would have perforce existed, and consequently there would have been able to be two or more gods. Because if you think of this possibility, but this is absurd, according to Spinoza. Therefore, things could not have been brought into being by God in any other manner, etc. So for Spinoza, this is how this God designed nature or reality to be. So it could not be any other way except this one that God created or that one designed. Okay, so it appears to be like it's already a creator, but this is how the point is, this is how things came to be. Therefore, this must be within the power of this being. So God's power is identical with His essence. Proof of this, from the sole necessity of the essence of God, it follows that God is the cause of Himself. Wherefore, the power of God, by which He and all things are and act, is identical with His essence. Whatsoever we conceive to be in the power of God necessarily exists. Okay? Proof, whatsoever is in God's power must be comprehended in His essence in such a manner that it necessarily follows therefrom and therefore necessarily exists. So, okay, I will just skip some of these quotations here. I'm just flashing it so that it's part of it becomes part of the recording of our session, so that you can go back to this and read. Now, so in the remainder of part one of the Ethics, Spinoza derives various properties of God. He summarizes these properties in the opening paragraph of the appendix to part one. So here, and this is the sort of a summary of what he has so far presented in the first book. I've shown that one, that he necessarily exists, God necessarily exists, that he is one, that he is and acts solely by the necessity of his own nature, and that number three is very important. He acts by the necessity of his own nature. That he is the free cause of all things and how he is so. That all things are in God and so depend on him. That without him they could neither exist nor be conceived. And lastly, that all things are predetermined by God, not through his will or absolute fiat, but from the very nature of God or infinite power. And this last item, number seven, is very important because there's always a debate whether God, i- now we can shift to the Christian or even to the Jewish Judaic belief about God as the creator. Okay, the question is, did God create the world or reality out of his free will or out of his nature? And according to Spinoza, he did not create this because he's going to decide whether to create or not. He created because that's part of his nature to create. That's part of his power. So he did not spend a time thinking, should I create or not? Right? So I have further, where occasion offered, taken care to remove the prejudices which might impede the comprehension of my demonstration. Yet there still remain misconceptions, not a few, which might and may prove very grave hindrances to the understanding of the concatenating of things, as I have explained it above. I have therefore thought it worth while to bring these misconceptions before the bar of reason.